The original version of GPT-4 released by OpenAI in March 2023 was GPT-4 0314. In June 2023, OpenAI released a new version called GPT-4 0613. So what is new in this new version? The most amazing feature that comes with this version is called function calling. Well, if you use GPT-4 0613 as a developer, you can now describe functions to the model and have the model extract parameters for that function from your prompt. This way, you can easily connect GPT's capabilities with external tools and APIs. Let's understand this through an example. Let's consider the following prompt, where you ask the model to give you the weather in London. Well, at the moment, ChatGPT cannot provide real-time information. But what you can do with the new version is pass a function called getCurrentWeather that takes a couple of parameters, the location and the units. You would need to describe those in the code. I'm going to show you later how to do that in the code. So this way, you are telling ChatGPT that you would need to use a function and that the model would need to extract some parameters for you to run that function. So what ChatGPT is going to do here is extract the parameters from your prompt, meaning the location and the unit. And then when you run the prompt through ChatGPT, you will get those parameters. So here the location is London and the unit is Celsius. And obviously the function is getCurrentWeather. Now, when you get this output from ChatGPT, which is returned to you in JSON format, you can use it to run the getCurrentWeather function, which you would need obviously to define in your code. So we can do that using an external weather API, and we will get something like the temperature, units, and description of the weather. Now we've got all the data we need to provide the user with a final result describing the weather in London. So we're going to run another request to ChatGPT with the weather information in order to get the final result to display to our user. And this time the output is going to be something formatted in natural language describing the weather to the user. So as you can see here, we've got a chain of requests. The first request is a request sent to ChatGPT, then the other request is a request to an internal API or an external API, and then the final request is another request to ChatGPT where the output is the actual description of the weather as we wanted from the very beginning. As you can see, the function calling feature of the new version of GPT-4 is so powerful as it saves you tons of time and work. Instead of having to write code to extract data or function parameters from users' prompts, function calling allows you to more reliably get structured data back from the model and pass it to your internal or external APIs. This used to be a tough task that required a lot of work using external tools like LangChain. So how does it work exactly? Well, instead of sending just a message to the model, now you would need to include a function in the request. You would need to provide the name of the function, the description of the function, and its parameters. Now this needs to be described in JSON format. We're going to cover that in detail when writing the code. And then the output of the model is going to include something called function call. And this will give you the name of the function as well as the arguments in JSON format. Now, this is just the first request in the chain that we send to the model. You would then need to use the function name and arguments to run the code using an internal or external API and then send the data back to the model to get a response in natural language. and we will cover that in detail when writing code for this example. Let's move to another example. Here we send a message to the model saying email Peter to check if he is attending the meeting. Now obviously ChatGPT cannot perform this action on its own, but we're going to give it a function name and parameters. So the function is send email, which takes a couple of parameters, the email and the body of the email. So when we send the request to ChatGPT, it's going to come back with the function name and the parameters that the model extracted from our prompt. And then we can use an internal API to send the email, which will then produce an output that we can then send to the model and get an output in natural language. Now, if we analyze the first request in this chain, we can see that we send a prompt to the model as well as a function, and we describe the function to ChatGPT, providing the name of the function, the description and parameters. And this is going to be in JSON formats, and then the output of this first request is going to be something that includes a function call with the name of the function and the arguments of the function formatted in JSON format. Now let's have a look at another example. Here we ask the model who are our top 10 customers this month. Again, we're going to pass a function that we include in our request. So the function this time is get customers by revenue, and it takes a few parameters inside an object. So we've got the start date, the end date, and the limit. So if we send the request to ChatGPT, we will get a response that looks like this. So we've got the function, then the start date, which will be extracted from our prompt, the end date as well, and then the limit, which refers to the number that we extract from the prompt, in our example 10 customers. This is then passed to an internal API, and then we send another request to ChatGPT and we get a response in natural language. So how does it work? Well, we send the first prompt with the description of our function, the name, description, parameters, and then we get a response that includes something called a function call, and it is formatted again in JSON format, and inside it we've got the name of the function and the arguments to pass to the internal or external API. In the next video, we are going to build a fully working example using the function calling feature. I'm so excited to take you through this amazing journey in the next video. In order to make the implementation of the function calling feature easier to understand, I'm going to do this in 3 steps. In each step, I'm going to build a request in the request chain. So we're going to have 3 requests. The first one is the one we send to the model with the message and the details of our function. And then the second request is the one we send to our internal or external API. And then the last request is the one that we send to the model again with the output of the internal or external API and our function. So in this video, we're going to focus on that bit where we send the message and function details to ChatGPT. And then ChatGPT is going to extract the arguments of the function from our message and return them along with the function details. To save time, the starting code is going to be the one we built for our chat application previously. So I'm going to make one change to the chat application. I'm going to delete the system role for now and keep only one message that we send to the model when we place a request. So I'm going to save and try the app to make sure things are working. So what is the weather like in London? So as expected, the model replied saying that it cannot provide real-time information. So what we're going to do is add another parameter to our request, and that's going to be a functions parameter. Let's have a look at the documentation on the OpenAI website to see how it works. So previously we used to send only messages in our requests. Now we're going to send an extra parameter which is called functions. This is an array formatted in JSON format where you pass all the functions that you want to the model, and then the model is going to decide based on your prompt which function is actually suitable for your prompt. So in our scenario here, we're going to pass only one function. So let's copy this parameter and place it inside our request. Now let's have a quick look at our functions parameter. So again, it's an array of functions, and inside each function you'll find details about that specific function. So we start with the name of the function, and that's important because that's the name that you're going to use later on to call the function. And then we've got a description. This helps the model understand the parameters of the function and how to extract them. So if you're getting the current weather in a given location, then the model will understand when you pass the parameters what details you need to extract from the prompt. And then we've got the parameters. So in this example, we've got an object that we pass as a parameter to the function. And this object has got properties. So it's got a location property, which is going to be a string, and its description is the city and state, and that's the location. And then we've got a unit parameter, which is also a string, and we've got here two choices for that parameter, either Celsius or Fahrenheit. And then right after the properties of our objects, we tell the model which of these properties is required. So the location is required, but we don't have to specify in our prompt whether we want the unit to be Celsius or Fahrenheit. Now, if you want to build the function calling functionality for any other projects, you can still take this example and amend it as you like. Now let's test our code and see what we get. Before doing that, I'm going to stick for now to GPT 3.5 Turbo, as it's quicker. So let's save and run the code. We are not getting anything in the results box, but if we look at the console, you can see the returned data object, and if you go inside the choices array and go to the first element, then message, you can see that the content is set to null. And if you remember, we set the result variable to the content property of the message, and the condition to show the result box is that result is true. And obviously here null is coerced to false, so we don't see any results box. So in this scenario, rather than printing the content property of our message, we're going to print this brand new property of our message objects, which is the function call. And you can see that the model extracted from our prompt the arguments of our function, and that's the location. And it returned also the name of the function to execute later. Now, if we look at the JSON results, we can't see it either in the output, and that's because it's got a condition result as well. So what we could do is, rather than using the results condition, we could create another variable, results OK, for example, and then we can set it to true if the response.ok is set to true. So set response OK to true and set it to false otherwise. And let's declare it right there. And this is supposed to be response OK. So let's save, try our code, and this time it works, and we've got the JSON output in the JSON box. And again, the content in the output is set to null, and we've got a function call in the output with the name of the function and its arguments in JSON format. Alright, now we are done with the first request in the implementation of the function calling feature of the latest version of GPT-4. In the next video, you are going to send those arguments to the weather API and get the weather. In this video, you are going to build the second request in the function calling request chain. So in this request, you are going to send the function and the arguments extracted from the message sent to ChatGPT in the first request to the weather API. And then the API is going to return the function as well as the weather details, including the temperature, the units, and the description of the weather. I'm going to use weatherapi.com, which gives you a generous number of calls per month for free. You can use another weather API if you like, but I would strongly recommend that you use the same one I'm going to be using so that you use the same code covered in this video and avoid errors. So all you would need to do is sign up to their website and get an API key. Once you sign up, you just need to go to your dashboard and you can get your API key from there. Then you would need to go to your backend inside the .env file and then place your key right there, starting with something like weather API key equals. Let's save. And now we are ready to build our second request. So the first call here refers to the first request. So rather than returning the completion as we did right there, now we are going to place the second request and get the weather. So that is the first request, and then that is the second request, and then later on we're going to have our third request when we send a new request to the model again. Now, before going ahead and sending the second request to get the weather, we are going to check if we've got a function calling. So to do that, we're going to navigate to the function call property by going to the choices array, first element, then message, then function call. So if we've got a function call, then we will get the details of the function, including the name of the function, the arguments, and then send a request to get the weather. So I'm going to get the called function first and store that inside a variable. I'm going to call called function. So I'm going to go to the completion.data.choices, first elements of the array, then message, then function call. And then we're going to check if we have a function calling. We will do that by checking the value of the opposite of called function. So if this is true, that means we don't have a function calling, and in that case we're going to send the response like that, and then we'll have a return statement to exit the function. Otherwise, we are going to get the function name and arguments. So I'm going to do that using destructuring. So I'm going to define a constant object, and inside the objects I'm going to have the name, which I will set to function name, and arguments, which I'm going to set to function arguments. So if we set the value of this object to called function, then we will extract the values from that object. So since called function has got a name property and arguments property, this means that inside the values, or inside these variables, we are going to store the name and the arguments of the function. Now the function arguments are formatted in JSON format. In order to transform that to an object, we can use the JSON.parse method. So I'm going to define another variable, call it parsed function arguments, which I'm going to set to the output of JSON.parse of function arguments. Now, before sending the weather request, we will need to check that the name of our function is getCurrentWeather. If that's the case, then we'll send the weather request. So if the value of function name is getCurrentWeather, then we will send request number 2, which is getWeather. So I'm going to store the output inside a variable that I'm going to call weather object. So inside this object, we're going to have a few properties. So we want the temperature, the units of the temperature, and the description of the weather. And we're going to use a function which we will define in a bit. I'm going to call it getWeather. So this function will take as a parameter the parsed function arguments, which are easier to manipulate instead of the JSON format. Now let's define our getWeather function. So let's do that right after the run completion function. So going to be an asynchronous function. And it's going to take as a parameter the parsed function arguments. So inside this function, we're going to try to send a request to the weather API. So we're going to have a try and catch statement. So if we've got an error, then we will console.error. So I'm going to use Axios to send a GET request to the API. So let's store the response inside a variable response. So to use the GET method of Axios, we're going to need to import Axios. So I'm going to have a constant Axios set to require the module Axios. Let's install this module. So npm install Axios. Let's start the server again. So inside the get request, we are going to send a couple of things. So we will need the base URL, which is this one for the weather API I'm using, and then an object where we define the parameters, including the Q parameter, which refers to the location. And that's something we're going to get from the passed function arguments dot location. And then the key is the API key, and we're going to get that from process.env.weather API key. The response is going to have a data property where we're going to have the details of the weather. So I'm going to create a new variable weather, which I'm going to set to response.data. Basically, we just need the temperature, units, and the description of the weather from this weather object. But for now, let's return the whole weather object, which will include various details that we actually don't need. Now, to make things easy to understand, I'm going to return a JSON object, including both the output of the first request and the second request so far. So I'm going to send a JSON object made of two properties. So I'm going to call the first property request1, inside which I'm going to have the data or the output of the first request, and inside request2 I'm going to have the weather object. So let's have a quick look at our React component just to make sure that we don't get any errors. So when trying to set the result to something like this, we will get an error. So I'm going to comment that line. And now the returned object doesn't have a data property. So let's just show the whole data objects, which will show request1 and request2 properties. So let's save and try our code. This is so exciting. So we've got both the output of the first request, which includes the details of our function call, including the name and arguments of the function, and also the output of the second request, which we sent to the weather API. And inside the current property, we've got the temperature in Celsius and the temperature in Fahrenheit. And then the condition, which is partly cloudy. So this is really good progress, because now we can get all the details of the weather that we need, including the temperature, the condition, and the units, which we would normally get from the arguments of our function call. So if I change the prompt to something like what's the weather like in London, provide the temperature in Celsius, then this time in the function arguments, we're going to have another argument, which is the units set to Celsius. Now, just notice that if you try a prompt that does not fit the function call of get current weather, then we just get data of the first completion, and you can see the content right there. Basically, our code stops right there, and we don't go to the second request at all. Now, if you try a weather-related prompt, then you get both requests. Now, if you go to the OpenAI documentation website, you will find a new parameter called function call. That parameter is set to auto by default, in which case the model is going to pick between an end user or calling a function, depending on the prompt or the message that is sent to the model. If you specify a value of none, that means the model is not going to call any function, and you will get an end user message rather than calling a function. You can also specify the function that you want to call in all scenarios using the name property and specifying the exact name of the function. So in our case, we didn't set the function call parameter, which means that it's set to auto by default by the model. Now, if you go to the OpenAI documentation website, you will find a new parameter called function call. That parameter is set to auto by default, in which case the model is going to pick between an end user or calling a function, depending on the prompt or the message that is sent to the model. If you specify a value of none, that means the model is not going to call any function, and you will get an end user message rather than calling a function. You can also specify the function that you want to call in all scenarios using the name property and specifying the exact name of the function. So in our case, we didn't set the function call parameter, which means that it's set to auto by default by the model. Now you are going to write further code to get the temperature, unit, and description of the weather. The unit is going to be extracted from the function call arguments, and the temperature and description of the weather will be extracted from the current property of the output of the weather request. Let's go back to the getWeather function. So rather than returning the weather object, I'm going to create a new object and extract details from weather.current. So inside this object, I'm going to have the condition property, the temp C, which refers to the temperature in Celsius, and temp F, which refers to the temperature in Fahrenheit. Then we're going to get the unit from the passed function arguments. Now the problem with this value is that it may return undefined if the user does not specify the units in their weather prompts. So to go around this, we're going to say that the default value is going to be Celsius unless the user specifies that they want the temperature in Fahrenheit. So if this value is different from Fahrenheit, then we're going to set the unit to Celsius. Otherwise, we're going to set it to Fahrenheit. So now we've got the unit, and then the temperature is going to be either temp C or temp F, depending on whether the unit is Celsius or Fahrenheit. So if the unit is Celsius, then it's going to be temp C, otherwise it's going to be temp F. And now we are ready to return our object, which is made of the following properties. So temperature, unit, and description. Now the description is going to be set to condition.text. So let's save and try our code. So here we've got our first request, then the output of the second request this time is our object made of the temperature, unit, and the description. Now if we try with a weather prompt asking the temperature in Fahrenheit, then the output is going to be in Fahrenheit. And if we don't specify the unit at all, then we expect it to use Celsius, and that's exactly what we get. Alright, so this is really good progress building our chain of requests. So we built the first request, the second request. So in the next video, we will build the last request where we send these details to the model and expect to get a message in natural language. In this video, we are going to build the third and final request in the request chain, and this time we're going to send the output of the weather API to the ChatGPT model in order to get the weather in natural language. Alright, so that's our first request we sent to the ChatGPT model, and that's the second request which we sent to the weather API, and now rather than returning this JSON object, we are going to run our third request. So the third request is going to be a request that we send to the ChatGPT API, and it's going to look like the first request with some changes. So let's call this response instead of completion. And let's call the new function run completion 2. So let's go ahead and create this function. So I'm going to copy paste the first run completion function. This new function is called run completion 2. So in the messages, we're going to add a couple of messages. So the first message that we're going to add is the message that we saw in the output of the first request. If you look at the first request output, this is the message that we got. And inside the message, we've got a role set to assistant, a content set to null, and a function call with the name of the function and its arguments. Alright, I'm going to copy that message and paste it right there. And just for consistency, I'm going to put the role and contents of the first message inside double quotes. So in the arguments of the function, rather than having this value, I'm going to set that to the function arguments, which I'm going to pass as a parameter right there. And when we call the function run completion 2, we're going to pass the function arguments right there. Now let's go back to our run completion 2 function, and let's add another message to the array of messages. So this time our message is going to be slightly different. The role of this message is going to be function. And this is a brand new role in the latest version of GPT-4. So far we had the system, user, and assistant roles. And this is a fourth role introduced by OpenAI that came with the new feature of function calling. So this message role is function. On top of that, we're going to have a name value, which we are going to set to the name of our function. And then the content is going to be set to the output of the second request in JSON format. So to do that, I'm going to get the weather object, which I'm going to transform to JSON format using JSON stringify. So we're going to pass that in the function parameters, just like this. Alright, to summarize, we are sending our final request with 3 messages. The first message is the message that we sent with the first request, and that includes the message of our user requesting the weather in a certain location. Then the second message includes the output of the first request, and that includes the function call property, which comes with the name of the function to be called and its arguments. And then the third message is a message with a role set to function, and that message's content is set to the output of the second request, which is the weather details. Alright, once we run the third request, we're going to send the response to the React application. So instead of doing that, I'm going to send response.data. And we don't need this anymore. So let's save. Also, let's uncomment this line to get the result. And also, we don't need data.data. We can just go directly to data.choices because we are sending back the response as it is. So let's try our code. And here we go. It's really amazing. We get the weather in natural language and our chain of requests is working as expected. You can ask for the weather in a different language and the model is going to return the weather in the same language. This example brilliantly demonstrates the immense power of the function calling feature, which truly unlocks limitless possibilities for developers to create advanced applications using significantly less code than before.